Hello, everybody. This is Craig Watson from the Pacific War Channel. Today, I'm joined by a new face. He's a friend. He also happens to be a Patreon over on the Pacific War Patreon account. Gaurav, how are you?
Hey Greg, thanks for having me here. So for everyone that doesn't know, I've been a fan of Craig's. I not only see his work on his channel, but I've also seen his work on Kings and Generals. And I have to admit, his Pacific War series is like what I look forward to every single week.
Oh man, you're making me blush. Thanks so much. And honestly,
It's
of all the fans I've had, I straight just straight up saying, you ask questions probably on a daily basis. You're probably the most engaged person I know who's a Pacific War enthusiast.
Well, I mean, I love war history. I know I do admit there are certain areas that I really specialize, like, some parts of the world, Second World War or ancient Rome. But, through your channels, I'm actually learning even more. So I'm always happy for that.
Awesome. And I mean, you said it already. I happen to work for Kings and Generals, so I narrate two podcasts over there: the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Age of Conquest: The Fall and Rise of China podcast. Which, my God, it's been years now that we're doing this, and doesn't let up. Every single week, I got to pump out those episodes. On top of, I write for the YouTube channel as well, of course. And God, there's a lot of series actually that I write currently.
Yeah, I think I actually had to take like a bit of a break from the podcast because, just so much saturation because I learned of the podcast quite late. And your episodes there are much more detailed, so I think now
Yeah.
I'm just like maybe 4 episodes behind the release. So I think I'm just on like approaching the Battle of the Philippine Sea in like maybe
Yeah.
2 episodes now.
Yeah, that's a really exciting episode too. It's the turkey shoot as the Americans call it. It's not talked about as much as something like the Battle of Midway. Certainly, I guess it's underrated in some ways, and I guess that touches upon the subject that we're tackling today. And
True enough.
I'll just let the audience know this was really spontaneous. I asked you what you thought might be good content for a podcast, and then you came up with the idea of what are underrated moments or battles, whatever you want, of the Pacific War. And I totally let you choose. I let you choose, and you came up with some really fascinating subjects. And I think the audience is going to get a good kick out of this. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know I now have a Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. Over there you can find exclusive Patreon episodes and podcasts based on suggestions from patrons, and other benefits like early access to all of my content, live hangouts, your name in the end credits, and much, much more. So please go check it out.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects of the Pacific War which, many things get their due credit because they were decisive. I'm not taking away from like what we know as decisive, like the invasion of the Philippines in 1944,
Yeah.
Midway, Okinawa, like the China theater. But we have to give everything their fair credit.
Yeah, of
So
course.
that's why I'm really interested to speak on these topics.
Ironically, a lot of people would also say that the Pacific War is underrated compared to, World War II in Europe. It gets overshadowed quite
Uh,
often.
No, it's actually quite true because, I think that also comes down to the fact that, Britain ultimately did try to push for a Europe first strategy.
Of course.
And, the Americans also accepted that even when Japan was the first Axis power that kind of engaged in war with the United States. And
Yeah.
I think Europe also gets that benefit, that theater is because, the fighting on the Eastern Front was just gigantic if you just count the number of combatants, vehicles,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. The Eastern Front is arguably, I think if anyone wants to tackle World War II, the Eastern Front has to be its complete own series. It's absolutely insane in scope, and much like the simple, just the war with China and Japan. It's very similar to the Eastern Front, where you're just seeing incredible numbers, incredible casualties. I mean, there's nothing like both those theaters. And yeah,
Yeah, I think let's just get started with this because I
of
think then
course,
we might just go on a tangent.
true,
So
true. So yeah, the first topic that you had come up with is it's an interesting one. It's actually one that's been brought up by a lot of people. Dave from the Cold War channel, for example,
Mm-hmm.
he's an enthusiast of this one. It's the submarine warfare. It's ironically referred to as the silent service. So, why did
Um,
you pick this one? Why do you find this one's an underrated aspect?
See, when we speak in the context of the Pacific War, a lot of people when we talk about like the naval engagements, right, where only ships are involved, you
Yeah,
might talk about Midway. You might say even if people might even talk about the Savo Island battle where US got quite a thrashing, Vela La Vela, the naval battles of Leyte Gulf, etc. Or, like the last voyage of the Yamato. They have attention, but ultimately they do involve combat ships against combat ships. You might be trying to divert away the supplies, but it kind of ties down to the one aspect of war that never gets its credit is the logistics side of the house. Right. It's great you have a good army, great technology, everything. But if you're not going to feed and arm your troops, what's the point? And
exactly.
so I think this is where because the US especially attacked Japan shipping once they fixed their torpedo issues, and that really crippled their not only their supplies but literally the flow of troops because like seeing some of the videos, like one troop ship is just wiped out and an entire regiment of men is gone.
Yeah,
And quite a lot of times, like even if the men are saved, they're practically disarmed. You
yeah,
might
I
as well just
know.
send them with, with clubs to the beaches.
Yeah, and you had just mentioned the torpedo issues, and I think that that's a big part of the Pacific War question here. Is for the audience members who don't know, the United States came into World War II with two torpedoes, the 14 and the 5 Mark 14 and 15, and they were unbelievably faulty. I think the percentage was something like 10 to 20% actually would detonate and properly and when launched, but if you were to break it down, there was four major issues with the torpedoes that were used by the American submarines. One of them was that the contact pistols weren't functioning
Mhm.
properly. So when it has to actually hit the sub, the magnetic contact pistol, I guess you would call it, or the magnetic device, it was prematurely exploding. For the torpedoes
Yeah.
that were being launched by aircraft, they dove way too far, and
Hmm.
also, the torpedoes had this general problem where they would go in the opposite direction all the time. Like they would do circles or even
Yeah.
come back and hit the ship that launched them. And
That's pretty much
yeah,
not what you want as a submarine commander. And I think one more thing also was even like the Mark 14, which was primarily submarine, and then you had the Mark 50, which was, more surface ship launched. They ended up going, about 10 feet lower than their intended target. Because from
yes,
what I know, like the sub commanders, you will set a predetermined depth because you want to hit it just, I think, just at the bottom of the ship,
yeah.
below the surface. So if 10 feet is quite a bit for any ships, especially like maybe like the smaller vessels like a destroyer or merchant ship, it could just sail right underneath.
Oh yeah. And so for the first half of the war, the Americans were basically we can call them they were duds they were using. And the US Navy, I mean, this was a huge scandal. The bureau for the Navy, they were unwilling to actually look at the issue. They just didn't believe the commanders that were sending reports in. And there's a lot of reasons for this. For example, they had put a lot of finances into designing the torpedoes. They had already produced many of these torpedoes, so it would have been humiliating to finally switch it. So eventually they tackled each problem individually and they fixed them. But this only gets fixed early 1943, all the
And
problems together.
I think that really we have to give that credit to Admiral Charles Lockwood
Yeah.
because he's the guy that really pushed for it and fought back against the institution, and that itself is a battle.
Oh, yeah.
I
He got a
mean,
lot of flack for it.
because yeah, because from what I was also understanding, like these issues, right? Especially like with the higher ups not believing the commanders, it actually came down pretty much to Admiral Ralph Christie, who actually did play a big role in the development of these torpedoes and their contact pistols. So I can kind of understand why he's not going to really accept the faults because it's
Yeah,
his baby.
exactly.
But you know, I think, Lockwood, on the other hand, like, he really pushed and this is where, you really see, the impact that they put, right? Because I think maybe it was in one of your videos, it said, like the pre-war just before Pearl Harbor, right? The Japanese estimated they needed like about 6 million tons of merchant shipping to supply all their forces across all theaters.
Yep.
And at that time, I think they had more than enough. And we know, right, 1942, the US submarines were basically like, at the best counts with this kind of impact that they were
Yeah.
putting. But, after that, the amount of submarine destruction that they caused,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, I think, like we were alluding a bit to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, right? Just at the start of the podcast. One of the Japanese carriers, Taiho itself, was actually like fatally damaged by a torpedo, the Albacore, I think,
Yep.
which I think it released like caused the damage, and then the fuel lines, I think, started venting out the gas,
Yes. Yeah, that was how it happened. Yeah.
and then it just created a bomb, and the most powerful sub carrier of Japan was sunk.
And I mean, vice versa. If you're looking at the Battle of Midway, it was a Japanese submarine that got the killing blow in the Yorktown. So technically, it
Uh,
was a subkill.
yeah, it was, but I'll kind of just pass on that because Yorktown itself was so badly damaged from the Coral
True.
Sea.
Yeah, it's very
And
true.
I'm gonna give it like one thing. I know it's a bit of a digress, but the fact that Yorktown limps back to Pearl Harbor, the naval architects are like, oh yeah, we're gonna need like a few months to get his ship seaworthy again. David's are like, yeah, 72 hours.
Yep. And they were on the ship as it went out repairing it still. And they did such an incredible job. The Japanese actually mistook it to be an undamaged aircraft carrier. That's why they
Yeah,
ended up attacking it.
yeah, I was actually about to come to that because it was attacked by the first wave when they went out against carriers, and again, they repaired it, and they're like, oh, they said the carrier was quite badly damaged to smoking, so this must be another task group. Let's attack.
Yeah, and just
But
to give the audience an idea, before 1943, you can say that the Japanese merchant fleet losses are they're significant, of course, but when you look at the number, as soon as 43 hits, it all of a sudden goes up to 1.5 million tons of shipping. You take it one more year in 44, that turns into 2.7 million tons. That's
yeah, actually,
it's game over.
even I'm just looking at like some numbers I had just looked at. You know, if we keep that 6 million tons or just about as
Yeah.
the requirement, right, which is the pre-war estimate by the Imperial Army,
Mm,
you know, until the end of 1942, they were still hovering around there, but 1943, like the net loss,
yeah.
you know, was insane. Like they lost almost 1 million tons of shipping.
Yeah. And
And I mean,
the insult to injury is when the torpedoes solution happens in 43, it's
yeah,
almost like an instantaneous result. The Japanese are taken completely off guard by the amount of tons lost for their merchant ships. And because the IGN doctrine, basically, I don't want to say they didn't have a doctrine for anti-submarine warfare, but they almost didn't. They were relying on just classic, sonar and depth charges using destroyers, which everybody who began World War II at the Navy, this was the beginning for everybody. The
yeah,
Japanese simply didn't evolve past this. Alongside this, there is a rationale because the IJN doctrine, they were 100% offensive focused, and they had the misbelief of only using their submarines for offensive warfare, so against surface warships, instead of going
yeah.
after merchant fleets. And they would actually maintain that policy all the way till like late 44. They would only kind of change in 44. I mean, by that time, it's literally impossible for them to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that in 1944, like over 4 million tons of merchant shipping of the Japanese Empire
Yeah.
was sunk, that itself will speak volumes. And it's kind of sad because, they did start to pick up, but, they were, I think, the only major naval power that never adopted the convoy system, which,
Yep.
because Britain was facing a similar problem in
Of
the
course.
Atlantic. And as you said, pre-war, everyone believed the destroyer was the ship. that was to counter the submarine threat. But they were actually quite versatile assets that, it was actually not worth their time being used against submarines and escort duties.
Yeah. Actually,
So
since
that's
oh, carry on. Sorry.
yeah, so that's why, like, there were destroyer escorts that came into the Atlantic, but never had that. And, with such unescorted like, convoys going through, the US submarines are like, I think they had their own turkey shoot in their way.
Yeah. Since you bring it up, actually, I'll talk a little bit about it since I myself I'm Canadian and it's kind of part of our history. But when the British Royal Navy encountered, World War II, and I think the most immediate problem they had was the U-boats. The Germans had a
Yeah,
fantastic system of going after their merchant fleet. So Britain was identical to Japan in the sense that they could be defeated simply by squeezing them of any convoys that could get over. So Britain tried to come up with an idea. What they did was they made the convoy system we know today. So instead of just dispersing ships kind of, I don't want to say randomly, but individually with almost no escorts, now they bunched up all of their ships into one, provided I mean, it evolved over time, but an escort force. And then if a whole convoy was to get over, it was a huge success.
yeah,
Unfortunately, the Germans, they figured out a counter to this with the Wolfpack tactics. So they had put out their submarines, made these kind of picket lines, and then as soon as somebody figured out, oh, here's a convoy, they would all converge.
yeah.
Unfortunately, and something we only kind of know, I would say more recently in history, uh, the Ultra
Hmm.
project, when they had defeated
Yeah,
the Enigma machine. Technically, the British were playing, we'll call it like 4D chess throughout World War II. They had completely deciphered all of the German communications, and the Germans, to talk to their submarines, had to use radio. So
yeah.
the British knew 100% of the time where the U-boats were. So they would just pick and choose how to let the Germans, get a few small convoys to make it seem like their, codes were broken. But they would use just a statistical analysis to allow the most that they could get over. And basically, they won the war doing that.
There's actually like a funny saying, Bletchley Park, especially once they got the rotor from, like, the submarine that was boarded. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the number, but in 1941 they captured the third wheel, which
Yep.
allowed Bletchley Park to improve its uh, computing power and decipher the machines. It was said, a German commander might as well just phone Bletchley Park to get his orders.
Pretty much. Yeah.
But the one thing I do want to also point out is, this is actually something I just found out very recently. The German U-boats were amongst like the submarine nations, had the worst underwater endurance.
Yeah, they could go under for about 24 hours, I think.
I think like when at full speed or something, if they were to use their battery, right? They basically had an endurance level of about a little over an hour.
Oh my God. Yeah, that doesn't work.
Yeah, and it was insane. And one thing I do want to also say is, you know, Admiral Donitz really at one point did suspect that the British might have broken the codes.
Yeah, yeah, of
Like he was
course.
getting, yeah, but ultimately he just said like, nah, that's impossible because I think the Germans were convinced that if you can type out one letter a million ways, you know, the chances are too low. So he actually believed it was not because they were able to they had the Enigma machines rotors, but it was probably like a mole or a double agent that actually was the source.
Which is it's believable. It really is believable because I mean, if anyone's ever seen, I forget the name. Is it the name of the movie with Cumberbatch?
Uh, is it mincemeat?
Magnificent. I forget the name of it, but they cover basically the history behind how they had created what was one of the first computers to, go through the Enigma code and everything. I don't think the Germans could have ever imagined the ingenuity of that project and how they would have crushed it.
I mean, I don't think most of us would ever be able to even understand it, but I guess that's why they employ the mathematicians.
True. And just another little element to the Atlantic submarine warfare. The British ended up not. It wasn't 100% thrown to us Canadians, but basically the escort duty for all the convoys fell onto us, and our entire navy was wrapped around it. So we only designed basically we made corvettes and small destroyers specifically
Yeah,
just for the escort duty. And technological innovations like the hedgehog weapon, which
yeah.
fired these, they're not depth charges, they're kind of like these other explosives that go in front of the ship.
Yeah, it's
uh
kind of when I saw the pictures, it almost felt like, a big mass of it's like a mix of like Katyusha rocket launcher and
it
a
looks like a
pod
Kyusha rocket, yeah,
with
yeah,
like, but instead of firing rockets, it's just firing like, something like the German stick grenades.
yeah.
It
and
kind of
uh
looks like that to
and
me.
it was ingenious because they blew up on contact. So unlike the depth charge where it's like a timed bomb, these things, if they
Yeah.
blew up, you knew that you got a sub. So it was much better for these guys who are specifically there for anti-submarine warfare, because usually the destroyers, when they drop these depth charges, they would have to wait and circle the area for almost an entire day waiting for the German sub to come up because they had like 24 hours of air. But with this,
Yeah.
you knew that you had already got them. So it was a great innovation. And
I
the
think, like,
kid,
just continuing on this, right? Because what I'm trying to allude to is Japan never really evolved drastically
no,
or in its in like convoy systems and protecting its merchant fleet. Britain, on the other hand, like they put so much effort. Like,
of course.
you had like not only had the same the escorts going up, then you had the half duck, the hedgehog. Coastal Command also started to send a lot more bombers on long patrols over the
Yep,
Atlantic. So, the mid-Atlantic gap was
yep,
growing smaller because, now you had bases in Iceland and everything. So, there were bases for the ships to, rest, repair, and, they could easily go and reinforce another convoy. And I think there was also like, the Women's Royal Navy Service, they actually wargamed very successfully, taught these maneuvers to the captains, and that actually paid off.
yeah. And
And
unfortunately for the Japanese, I mean, they created these monster submarines. They were the largest, but they were also slower, more cumbersome, and they weren't built for for merchant raiding at all. They were built, well, for what the Japanese thought that they were going to do. They thought that during surface engagements, the submarines would actually maybe go between and hunt down the carriers or even the battleships. And they did end up getting a few good hits early on in the war. I mean, the Wasp was
yeah,
taken, down. They hit the Saratoga, didn't go down, but they did cripple it.
hmm,
Yorktown, of course, and
yeah,
the North Carolina got hit, but it also did get taken down, really. But compared to the millions of tonnage that the United States is going to inflict, even you can even go back to the beginning of the Pacific War. The Dutch, they had pretty good merchant rating at the
uh,
beginning while they were still
I think
afloat.
there was that like their admiral, right, Shipper Day. I forgot his last name, but he was
Dorman,
like the best. Yeah, Shipper Day Dorman, I think.
yeah, yeah,
But
he
I
was
think
very aggressive.
one aspect that kind of just saddens, like, Japan's potential for this area of the war. Start of the war, they had the best torpedo in the world,
The Longlands,
the
yeah.
long lance. And not only it had such a superior range, it unlike the US and, like, some of the German torpedoes, it did not have that, like there was a good chance you're gonna get an explosion if you hit it.
Yeah, and the long lance, which I always mix up the numbers. There's the 95 is for the aircraft. The submarines had the 93, I believe, which is
Yeah.
almost identical to the what we call the long lance. But yeah, and it was a fantastic weapon. So you have a submarine that has the greatest range in the war, the most deadly weapon. At probably they had everything that they needed to be the most proficient merchant raiders, but they didn't even bother, really.
Yeah, and I think one more aspect that really helped with the US's submarine warfare against Japan is another aspect of Lockwood, not only with the technical and bureaucratic developments. Like, the guy cared for his crew and removed the scared commanders. Like, that
Yeah.
really boosted the morale because start of the war, these the submarine commanders were ultra cautious.
They had a whole different doctrine that dated back to peacetime. Like they're the
Yeah,
books that they were basing they had such weird beliefs. Like they believed that aircraft were the primary thing that would destroy their subs. So they didn't properly go up to hunt
Yeah.
things. They believed that submarines were almost only like exclusively for reconnaissance and that they weren't an offensive force. Like, it's insane when you look at the the beginning of the defense of the Philippines with Admiral Thomas Hart. His
Yeah.
commanders were they had, like, if they had better torpedoes, mind you, they could have actually done a lot of damage to the Japanese invasion fleet, but they completely floundered it. It's tragic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially if we compare to like 1943 and 44, where like,
Yeah.
one submarine is just taking the entire life literally out of a regiment.
Oh yeah, we
That's
should
like,
probably talk about the most famous submarine, the USS the Bowfin, that went
yeah,
out on those famous nine patrols. I guess you don't call them tours. And yeah,
yeah.
they the lion's share of tonnage, like just with this one submarine. I think how many? I know that they said they had taken down a number of vessels, and the Navy only like said it was about half of what they said, but it was like more than 30 ships. I think that they said they had sunk by themselves. It's super impressive, and I'm
I
talking
mean,
bigger
that,
ships.
yeah, I mean, that by the tonnage, I think they were like, getting like, if you go to the Atlantic, right? This is like literally like Gunther Preen's, like tonnage levels. And,
Yeah,
it's not as an insignificant amount by any chance. And I think one really good aspect that I really liked about Lockwood is, just caring for the crews, because I read stories, right? Like, because this would be a problem on any sub. You don't have space,
of course, yeah.
right? It looks
Unless you're
big,
Japanese,
but true. But you look, even though if it looks big, right? All these vessels. we- I think what we really tend to forget, even I'm guilty of that, is these vessels are small, like
yes,
because of the double hull shape. And when you're underwater for like an extended period of time, the air is stale, everything, so
it's very
you
true.
know the like what Lockwood also did, what with his aggression and taking care of his crew, I think that also helped him, you know really put a massive impact and effectiveness. And I think another underrated part of their job was picking up downed airmen
Of
and
course, yeah,
reconnaissance, like, because I think like Philippine Sea, the Taiho's move and the carrier group movements were monitored by submarine and not by radio, because the Ozawa was sailing under radio silence. But you know the US still had a fairly good like at least a broad idea that the battle is now imminent.
yeah. And I guess we'll push on to the next subject because I'm
Yeah,
realizing this is going to get long. But
true.
the second one you brought up, which is a colossal subject, we'll see how we'll tackle it. Uh,
Yeah.
the New Guinea campaign. So
Yeah.
why would you say it's underrated?
See, I know people talk about the New Guinea campaign,
Yeah,
because it is like the first major set of engagements. But I think why I'm saying it's underrated, it does not get the same limelight in the end within even the Pacific War theater as, like, say, the island hopping campaign, the Philippines campaign, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, etc. Like, or even China, right?
yeah.
It's kind of like
Guadalcanal is
brush.
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And maybe it's just because it was like initially there were not that many forces involved, but it does not change. It should not impact the significance of what could have been achieved, because if it was taken and they had a base to launch an invasion into Australia or threaten the supply lines, then US would have lost one major staging area,
yeah,
because this be what we like a staging area to then push back. That's pretty much where Douglas MacArthur, like after the Philippines in 1942, was pretty much based. If he lost that, I don't know if how it would have been much more difficult for the US to start a comeback.
yeah. And I think if you look at, because you had mentioned all the islands there, the thing that differentiates New Guinea from the island hopping warfare, although I still consider, I mean, New Guinea still was island hopping. It's just amphibiously being assaulted. It's the same place. It's just on different portions of
Yeah,
it. Uh, you look at all these islands, and we're looking at month-long campaigns. Like Guadalcanal, very long, but for the most part, I mean, Bougainville is pretty long, but most of these islands, it's an amphibious assault. There's a fight for the beachhead perimeter, and then gradually the island is secured, and it's pretty short process.
it's
New
about
Guinea,
week,
yeah,
2 weeks or something, right?
yeah, some of these are very quick. For New Guinea, it was the entire war. It was
Uh,
a slug of a match. It was really long.
yeah, and I think like, from what you talked about in your podcast for the Kings and Generals channel, like, just hearing about like, what those men, right? Regardless of the whether they're the Australians or Japanese had to go through, like, my God, like in terms of brutality and just
Yeah.
survivability, it's pretty much up there, And we know war is a dirty, gruesome thing, but this was like I think at a whole new level.
I mean, they, because the two islands that have the big nicknames, you have Starvation Island for Guadalcanal, and then I
Yeah.
guess it's lesser known, but a lot of it was the Japanese. They would refer to New Guinea as Green Hell because of the
Yeah.
terrain. But the terrain of New Guinea, for people who don't know, you see almost every geologic like it's you have mountains that are really high up. It gets frigid cold. You've got dense rainforests. You got every type of mud, every type of insect that can give you like your malaria, everything. You're gonna get everything in this place. It was the
And you're
worst
close to
terrain.
Australia
Yeah.
wildlife, distant cousins of Australian wildlife. But I think this is like, from a book I read, right? It's was like a book. It detailed the Kokoda Track campaign.
Mhm.
And I think, when the AI reinforcement started to arrive, I think what like, some things that just like, really it still sticks with me to this day. One Australian corporal was found dead, 30 Japanese corpses around him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, two of them was like, two of the Japanese corpses were, they were not shot, skull fractures with the butt of the gun.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that I've read this book. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
it's incredible. I mean, New Guinea was some of the most disgusting and fierce battles. For people who don't know anything about the New Guinea campaign, to just brutally summarize, uh, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is somewhat famous, kind of really kicks off what we think of as the New Guinea campaign. Because if the Battle of the Coral Sea went the other way and the Japanese had actually made their landing on Moresby, there is no New Guinea campaign. The Japanese would have probably retained it, and I don't know what Australia would have done with the American help when it came later on, late 42. But the Japanese, they launched this incredible offensive over the Kokoda Track, and they get
yeah.
all the way. They can see Moresby, and they run out. Their logistical line just cuts, and they literally have to go back. And as they are doing what is a fighting withdrawal the entire way back, while the Australians and eventually the Americans get involved, they just go up, they do the same track, and then it never stops the battles. You see
Uh,
the Bunagona campaign after that and such.
Yeah, but actually the thing is, what we should also consider is like the insane logistical effort, like especially with the native population, because a lot of these places you cannot even supply your platoon level, forget like a battalion level,
Yeah, because you're relying, like you
properly.
said, on natives. You have to have friendly
Yeah,
help,
and
and
I mean, like these people also deserve like a huge round of applause to them because, again, logistics, that's what's going to win you the war.
yeah,
And, I remember like, when the Austrians started the pushback on the Kokoda Trail, um, they had some artillery support, like a couple of 25-pounder guns or something. And they had to like literally drag them up the Owen Stanley range. And I'm
yeah,
like, oh God, first of all, you're already, exhausted from war, everything. Your
oh,
rations may not be perfect. And on top of that, you have the horrible weather. And on top
yeah,
of that, you're now dragging a gun and its ammo.
yeah. It's simply incredible. And I again, God, you know what? I didn't want to do this, but I got to bring it up just quickly.
Yeah,
At the beginning of the New Guinea campaign, of course, I think the one, if anybody knows any aspects of this, they know about the Bunagona campaign, Sandananda included.
yeah,
And MacArthur, he he pushed this campaign to go much quicker than it had to be, uh, because of the political reasons. He wanted to continue the drive to the Philippines, and he needed to maintain the initiative by being the guy who's getting closer and closer. And there was a incredible amount of unnecessary casualties because of how much he pushed the commanders. And I
yeah.
mean, if you look at all the sackings of how many people lost their job during just those campaigns, the whole reason is because MacArthur is pushing this as fast as he can. And
And
I just,
I
yeah,
would say like this guy did not really understand the terrain and what
I don't think
it's
anybody
going down on
did
the ground.
really.
Yeah, it's and when he spoke about the sackings, I think one thing that's really interested me is like, I do know like, there were a lot of personal rivalries and
Yes.
everything within the Allied generalship. But, with the new Guinea campaign, I think that's also quite a big battlefront that they went through. Like, for example, like General Savage was not, let's say, or high on MacArthur's list of respect.
Yeah.
So I think after a while, I think after closer to the Bunagona or I think Sanananda, I think that's where Savage last held command before he was temporarily, sidelined.
Yep.
Again, that was pretty much mostly due to MacArthur. And then I think when Savage took over of the, New Guinea later on, right? I think Western New Guinea's forces
Yeah.
of all Australian. I know he was recommended by Blamey, and I remember MacArthur was, I read like MacArthur was not at all pleased with this because I think he was gunning for Vasi to be taking that position.
Well, because
So,
there was the double-edged sword where MacArthur being an American, but not even supposed he wasn't even supposed to be a complete command of all Australian forces, but as
yeah,
you know, it's explained in long terms in the podcast for Kings and Generals. We
yeah,
go through the Alamo Force and how it's kind of
yeah,
this brainchild of MacArthur to kind of get his foot in the door to controlling more of the Australian forces, and he just basically supersedes everybody in the end so that he controls everything in really shifty kind of ways. It's kind of gross. And if
yeah,
any commanders, they weren't 100% on board with MacArthur. I mean, that's just how MacArthur did things. Like as they
yeah,
said, he didn't have a general staff. He had a court. you know
yeah. It's kind of like my way or highway.
exactly. And when people were yes men to MacArthur, like Sutherland, for example, the biggest yes man I think out of all of them,
Yeah.
these guys, they would last with MacArthur. They'd have exquisite careers, and they would make a lot of financial money on this. They make money on the side because I'm not going to get into it, but there's a lot of weird
Oh
things with
wow,
that.
that now I'm quite interested to hear that. Maybe I'll, you know,
Okay,
read
I'll
this,
just
but
really short. If you look just at the defense of the Philippines, when MacArthur made the choice to pull out,
yeah,
famously he was given, we'll call it, it was a gift from Manuel, the president, of I think
yeah,
it was like $500,000, and that's not illegal. It's just frowned upon. But what people
hmm
don't know, and I've tried my best to look into this story because there's only one source where I heard this. MacArthur apparently he called I think it was the mayor of Manila, and he purchased a bunch of stocks in local mining companies. I think there were silver mines or something, and he had made this deal that made him multiple millions of dollars later. And he did it because he knew he was going to be abandoning these places and what would happen to them, and that they would fall under Japanese control and stuff. And all of the people in his court, like Sutherland and them, they all got in on this. So you could call it like inside trading a little bit,
Oh
and
God.
that is illegal. That was illegal. And it's kind of this kind of gross stuff. And it happens continuously with MacArthur. There's these political things that he does, and then there's these financial things. And again, he was always kind of looking at the White House. During World War II,
Yeah.
at any point, he did consider he got Sutherland to go over to Washington to talk to the Republican Party to see if they'd be willing to, put a campaign on for
Um.
him. And it was actually people in the military that had served under MacArthur that kind of undercut it because they said, no, we don't want this guy to be running on the ticket. And he waited longer, but he could have run against FDR, and FDR was afraid that he would run.
Yeah, I did know that, because FDR was also known to like try to put people he trusted also because I mean
Of
that's
course.
what anyone would do.
Yeah.
But MacArthur, I know he was not at all fond of him and would have no doubt wanted to curtail his power if he had the chance, but he knew he could not. So
Yeah. Their
at least
their relationship was actually pretty special.
that's pretty much. But yeah, it's just because of like, the difficulties and just like I would call it the horrors that both sides had to experience.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
like after Les Salamo, the withdrawal of the Japanese, and you know, I have to credit like, the way they just keep trekking through the mountains, fighting off, and still maintaining some semblance of a disciplined fighting force.
Psst. Hey you. You ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor minute by minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh no, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it, without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. You know, it's really impressive if you consider other theaters of war, because ironically, I think one of the theaters of war where the Japanese dominated the majority of the time was Burma. For a long time, it was their playground. When Burma goes bad for the Japanese, the lack of it's insane, the lack of discipline. You hear instances of cannibalism for a lot of these islands. In Burma, the Japanese, like a lot of units, end up going off. Sometimes they don't even not even surrender on time, and they go off in the jungles, and they ended up becoming cannibals, and all sorts of horrible stuff happens. And in New Guinea, there is that aspect too. But in New Guinea, like, it was probably the worst conditions the Japanese would have to face, and they didn't collapse.
Yeah, I mean, like the fact that they still maintain that entire pursuit across the country, right? Like, I mean, the retreat. And
They
sometimes,
retreated the whole way.
yeah, I mean, and I think that was like some of these divisions that fought from Leh Salama, Bunagona, they started withdrawing all the way back. I mean, those guys, the fact that you could do this for months, when you're getting pushed back so much, right? 1 or 2 retreats, it's not going to demoralize a soldier, but continuous retreats will.
Yeah, you're talking about some guys that might have seen years. I don't know how long you could possibly be stationed in New Guinea, but if you look at it, let's say point X would be close to Port Moresby for the guys who are on the Kokoda Trail, and then they're going all the way to the northern parts, even into western parts of New Guinea. By the end of it, it's a fighting withdrawal over not just long distances, but the mountain ranges, because they're all taking positions on the numerous mountains and ridges. It's absolute
And
insanity.
not to mention they have to fight. And we know for a fact, like once they even just started the retreat from Kokoda, supplies for the Japanese armies was even worse.
Yeah, this was the absolute length of their logistical line. People don't think about it so much because New Guinea is enormous in size, but it makes it even worse because if you're just a little bit in the interior, you might as well be in outer space. So
Yeah.
the Japanese logistics say these guys were foraging all the time. I don't think it was as bad as, for example, for the Japanese who were abandoned on Guadalcanal, like they legitimately were starved out. But for New Guinea, if you're spending half your time looking for, sweet potatoes, you're not going to win a
Yeah.
war. So that's
Yeah,
that.
I think it was like one of your diary extracts, like, read about like, the guys just wanting to just reward his men with rice, like a Japanese
Yeah.
commando. I mean, it just talks about the plight when this is all a commander, like, battalion commander just cares about. I think, Green Hell is honestly, I think it's just not even doing justice to the name from the experience of these guys. So just like, for what they went through, it's probably like because maybe it's not having the size of the invasions of the later battles. That's why I don't
Yeah.
think it gets the same level of prominence that it deserves. Because, quoting that book, right? He literally called like Kokoda Track like on decisiveness and toughness on par with like, the battles of Stalingrad.
I mean, I think the Australians call it their Stalingrad, if I'm not mistaken. I,
True.
uh, I,
But
I had done
the
an,
39th Battalion,
yeah.
like I think what the roll call in 1943 was just horrifying.
Yeah.
I think 32 men and officers were all that was left.
It's insane. And,
Yeah.
I'm for the audience members listening to this, if you're really interested to learn about the New Guinea campaign and you're willing to listen to a few hundred hours worth, over on Kings and Generals, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, I'm still covering it. It's not done. I mean, we only hit. I think at this point we're in Western New Guinea. We're just touching upon it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Itapana. Yeah, yeah. So we're at Western New Guinea, and it's still going to go on for months.
Yeah.
It's so
But
long.
I will say I've enjoyed it so much alone
Thanks.
and here, but it's also scary, but
Definitely.
it's but I think that's what we really need to also see because it's just easy to just see the numbers on the paper.
Yes, when you just break it down by the numbers, it definitely is. And
Yeah.
you brought up, I really like that you brought up this one. This one is very interesting because I think for Americans, because obviously most of the people, I think it's 80% of my audience is American. A lot of Americans aren't even aware this is a thing. But the third underrated point that you brought up was the Russian invasion of Southeast Asia. So the very end of World War II. Why do you think that's
Yeah.
underrated?
I think because, we know that Russia had a non-aggression pact with Japan that, they never really invaded. And this is something even I also never knew that they even launched an assault on Japan like in August.
Yeah,
But, it when I then started digging a bit into this, I was surprised that because it's not like just like a quick together force, like, relatively to this, like Kharkin Gold feels like a skirmish in comparison to this
I know
encounter.
yes, and that was a big battle. But this is as if okay, we just took Berlin. Everybody, let's just swarm right over and
E-
take Japan.
I mean, you're still talking about like, a size that would be comparable to Barbarossa, like
It's
D-Day,
uh, it's 1.5 million Russian. Yeah, it's 1.5
Yeah,
million
I mean, like,
Soviets.
yeah, I'm putting like 2.5 because I'm also counting the Japanese troops along with
Of
it to
course,
like
yeah,
show the total manpower involved, but it's just crazy. And I think this actually is like, I actually thought, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was what, turned the table for Japan to give an unconditional surrender. But it's quite interesting because now it really gets to this gray area because the Soviets did not even give Japan like much formal time because I was actually reading this and I think local time of Japan or whatever, the Soviet declaration of war comes at 11 p.m. on the night of
yep,
August 8th, which I think was the 3 month, just about at the 3 month deadline of the Yalta conference,
yeah.
where Stalin did promise that, hey, to the Western allies that, within 3 months of Germany's defeat, he will be invading Japan. And literally 61 minutes later, like literally one past midnight on 9th August, you have 1.5 million Russians. And these are not all like, they're not even green troops. Some of them are experienced already because
Yeah,
even though the Battle of Berlin ended, like, 3 months ago, over the next 3 months, Russia did start building up its forces properly, like, getting them tanks, supplies, self-propelled guns, aircraft. And, what I was seeing, like, they have about 4,000 tanks, aircraft, 1,800 self-propelled guns. Russian artillery will probably be, thousands of guns because they always seem to have an n number of those.
actually, here
And
I'll let the I can, you know what, let me. I did have some notes. Let me tell the audience because I think the scope and the scale of this will shock them. So
yeah,
the Soviets, like you said, it was like 89 divisions, 1.5 million men. You had even mentioned most of these are not Greens. A lot of experience, fighting the
yeah,
Germans, even the Finns and stuff. So we got combat veterans here who know how to use their weaponry. We have nearly 4,000 tanks. It's like 3.7 thousand, nearly 2,000 self-propelled guns, almost 90,000 vehicles, and nearly 4,000 aircraft. And a third of the
yeah,
combat troops, their support and services. So this is fully equipped professional army. On the other side, the Kwangtung army at this point is like it's a shadow of its former self because this is the end of the war. And General it's Otasa Yamada. Yeah, he's the guy that was he was leading the Kwangtung army at the end. He's got the first area army, the third area army, and some independent units for the Japanese side for the just the Kwangtung. And
yeah.
they got puppet troops, from Manchukuo and Majang, like you could say like an extra few 100,000 or so. But overall, they got like nearly a million guys altogether in 31 divisions, and they've have like less than 500 tanks, and these tanks are completely obsolete. They're like Hagos. There's no way that they can't even penetrate the
I
armor
mean,
of a.
like the I'm pretty sure like a 1942 Soviet tank versus this is like,
It's
comparing like, the German Tiger II versus the Sherman.
exactly. This is so ridiculous to even they're not even going to be used. They're going to be abandoned. But they do have like 2,000 aircraft. But this is late war. Most of the good aircraft has already left this area of the world, and they're being used in Ichigo and China, or they've been used in the Pacific. So they don't even have
Yeah.
great aircraft. They're far below strength. They're almost exclusively new recruits in green. That's
Yeah,
crucial.
I think like it was earlier in the year, right?
Yeah.
Um, like they also moved away like they replaced the soldiers with the green guys, and basically the last veteran troops had left towards the start of 1945 to other more crucial theaters in China
Yeah,
and the
Ichigo took a lot
Pacific.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, like, I think one thing that I also do want to add is the Kwantang army also, not only were they green and not having tanks or good aircraft, they did not even have much ammo.
More anti-tank guns. They were using
Yeah.
the old Type 1 37 millimeters. I don't think that could have penetrated the armor of most of the Soviet tanks. I mean, a T-34, no. I don't think I don't think their anti-tank guns would have done much. They barely had even machine guns at this point. They weren't using like they didn't have modern weaponry because everything was given to other, again, Ichigo got all this stuff because they were scrambling to just use the resources they had because they couldn't produce anymore. The Empire of Japan at this point. Like
I
I
think
think yeah. Continue.
I just want to say, like, they had only supplies for like about one third of the force to fight for like, a month or two. And
Yeah.
that just speaks volumes, right? Because like what are you going to do? I think the Russia they did ultimately, like, I remember, like, a lot of Russian tanks and everything were ultimately like the Japanese men strapped themselves in, like, basically, with mines to take out the tank,
Yep.
which was pretty much their most effective tank defense.
Yeah, a lot of the Russians reported anti-tank dogs too. The Japanese had gone into that, and that had its own. It's weird. That was a thing that the Russians had tried at one point too.
Yeah, I've read that, but I think what really makes it underrated and also, I guess, interesting is the timing.
Yeah, I wanted to
Because,
bring this up for the end
yeah,
part, so I'll get into it because
so,
you had already mentioned
uh,
it. The
yeah,
nuclear bombs and
yeah,
the invasion of what is Manchukuo, Mojang, well, Inner Mongolia and North Korea.
Yeah.
Americans are not going to like hearing this. I brought this up actually in other podcasts, and it's not like anything. It's not black and white. Like it's all one thing. It's all this. But the narrative that was taught to particularly Americans after World War II, in a lot of ways, was false. And there's actually a reason why they were taught that the significance of the nuclear weapons that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like the dominant factor that led to the surrender of Japan. It's not really true. It there's more evidence that the Russian invasion is kind of what got the Japanese to surrender. And people are going to be screaming right now at me
Yeah,
saying this.
true. No?
It's very complicated, and it deserves
Indeed.
like its own podcast. But to summarize it for audience members who don't know anything about this, by late 1944, Hideki Tojo, he loses his position. He gets ousted, and the Japanese know. Well, the high command knows that the war. They've known for a while that the war is over, and they're looking for the best possible peace deal to exit the war. What that looks like to them, might surprise us today. They thought that they could possibly hold on to Manchuria, and Manchuria, as my professor said in university, was kind of patient zero for World War II. The Japanese got addicted to the resources they acquired in Manchuria, and they became economically dependent on it. Like even their population boom, it was a place that they could, emigrate some of their people to, alleviate tensions at home. They received resources. It was the agriculture, it was the breadbasket of Asia. So it was feeding their booming population. And the loss of a place like Manchuria it was colossal for Japan. It was inconceivable. They were willing to give up everything almost in the Pacific.
I mean, that really puts it because considering like one of the key islands that they wanted in the Pacific was like the Dutch East Indies.
Yeah, of course.
That was like that was also one of the most significant territories. But I think even this was like new to me, right? Because even the narrative I also understood was like, it was the atomic bombings that really pushed it. But, when I also digged in, right? Like, as you said, when Tojo was out of power, I think if you include the emperor, there were about 7 guys in total that were kind of like, who were the guys who would decide any significant decision
Yes.
that Japan had to take. And I think even just prior to Hiroshima, it really reached an impasse because the emperor was not decisive, and they were basically like 3 war hawks and 3 guys wanting peace. So
It
that
came down
council
to
could not
Hirohito.
listen.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
did come down. He was being indecisive, and there's one book specifically. It's called The Making of Modern Japan, by Herbert P. Dix, excuse me. And we didn't know anything about this, but Kido, a guy who had written extensively in diaries about his time with Hirohito, when Hirohito
yeah,
died, this was the first time that a lot of these notes were released to the public. And this is when the public was actually told things like the Constitution of Japan was kind of forged by MacArthur and the Americans. Like it really was forced upon them. And this whole narrative was built around it. And the truth wasn't released to even the Japanese public. Like a lot of people didn't
wow,
realize a lot of what was going on in the wartime. For example, Hirohito was absolutely involved and in a lot of the horrible war crimes that were performed. He was knowledgeable about this and he signed off on a lot of it. And the
yeah, I
narrative,
know. I think like one of the decisions I know that at least I know that where he got involved was like, when the 17th Army from Guadalcanal refused to
yes,
evacuate. That's where I think when he gave a personal request or a letter, you cannot say no to the emperor. So that's really why the 17th Army agreed to even evacuate in the first place. So that is like one well-known example I know where he got directly involved. So I did read that, he was like, there, but, I think he really now started to show like, a lot of doubt, indecisiveness, which, I think in a situation like this, you need to be decisive one way or the other.
well, this is the issue. And the point made by the specific author I mentioned in question is Hirohito was taught from a very early age by specific people in his life that the most important thing was the kokutai. And you could spend a whole podcast explaining what that exactly is. I'll just say to the audience, the embodiment of the emperor, like the feeling of the people of Japan that like even their constitutional rights, which they don't have, it's actually the emperor who has their constitutional rights for them in a way. It's That's a weird
Yeah.
thing to say, but it's kind of how it works. But the divinity of the emperor that he should lead, even though he's on paper not leading. That's the weird thing about the Japanese constitution. Like it's written in such a way where he kind of has this soft power where if he says something, everybody's just going to generally agree and go with it. But
I
on
think, yeah,
paper, yeah,
like I think this is why, like, the Doolittle raid, because some of the bombs did just land on the Emperor's palace grounds.
yeah,
That actually caused the biggest, I think those was the real big outrage,
yeah,
not the other bombs that really fell, but, if by chance, like, just imagine if it had hit him, the Doolittle
oh
raid,
yeah,
that would have
and
been
yeah,
huge. And I know, like, even, when Japan did agree to surrender, I think like one thing that they still held on to as a condition to the US is the emperor's position is not to be challenged.
and it was
Like
a
it just
handshake
really proves
deal.
it. Yeah,
It
and
was
it
a
just really
handshake
shows
deal. Yeah.
the reverence that these guys have for the emperor of Japan. It's
Well,
huge.
I can't do it due diligence. I think if you had been listening, yeah, if you listen to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, at one point, I think at a few points, I tried to explain the Kokutai because no one can explain it. It's
Yeah,
it's explained in spiritual ways. It's the feeling that the emperor is divine and that the whole nation should be abiding by his will, but he isn't actually in, like, quote unquote, he's not actually in charge. Technically, the army is under him. Like he controls the army in a way, but he's not supposed to be dictating what the politicians do. The politicians were originally, they were supposed to have parties. They were supposed to have, proper cabinets. This all falls
yeah,
apart in the 30s, of course. But
yeah,
he was obsessed with the protection of the Kokutai. He thought it was his ultimate service as the emperor. He at all costs, this was the number one. And as this author argues, and I think it's absolutely true looking at the notes, he did horrible things thinking it would
yeah.
be necessary to protect this. And in the end, he did protect it because he retained being an emperor. He wasn't treated so much like a god after World War II, mind you. He went out in public, kind of like his grandfather did once upon a time. It was a lot more normalized under Meiji. But until his death, no one knew anything about the reality. Like everyone had assumed, oh, he was kind of a hostage. It was Tojo, or it was the Japanese militarism. They kept
Yeah,
him in a room and they were doing all this. It's the age-old thing in Japan, like even in ancient
yeah.
Japanese society, the hostage emperor, he's not the one, it's the shogun, or it's this daimyo's doing this.
I mean, it's just like, I think to be fair, that's a fair assessment because we do know during the shogunate, the emperor did not have
Yeah,
much power till the
of
Meiji
course.
Restoration. But this guy, he was involved. Maybe like not to the level of like, say, like, how the chief of staffs or army area commanders or the prime minister gets involved, but he was aware, he would participate in the meetings. And
he
that is
he
why even
signed he signed seals. Like there was
exactly.
multiple operations where they asked for the authority, the admission to be able to do something, and they're asking his permission, and he would be in a room and he would nod, say yes to whatever, and he was scrutinizing them all the time. There was this other narrative that he was a scientist in his lab all the time and that's all he ever cared about. If you look at it, he was reading every report he could get his hand on. He was specifically saying things to certain commanders. He was more close to the Navy, mind you, and he would like
Mhm.
try to push them towards certain things. And there was mistakes made because he would want certain things to be done a certain way, or he would be questioning. He's like, "You told me that we need to go invade this place, but we do not have the resources to maintain this. So you hope you get this place to get those resources. So isn't this a gamble?" And they would have to answer these questions like, yes, they were gambling all the time.
I mean, that is actually showing a level of involvement that, even
Yes,
like what Hitler was having, like, at least towards the start of World War II, because that time he was involved, but not to like the levels he took up after, the Russian invasion. But this is showing that he was not a hostage.
exactly. And to prove a point, for people to understand the timeline, Hiroshima happens and then the Russian invasion happens like on the same day, but afterwards. When there's all these there's a few specific meetings that happen just before the bombing of Hiroshima and then the bombing of Nagasaki, but during these conversations, and they had always been talking about how they're going to surrender, not whether they're going to surrender or not, but they had been for months trying with operatives in Moscow to get not just like an answer, but even a feeling from the Soviets as to could you broker a peace with us? We could get better terms because if we go with the Americans, we know the terms because of the Hull note and stuff. I
Yeah,
mean, Americans understand that from the viewpoint of Washington, Washington was ambiguous with what they wanted. Like they weren't willing to, give it was unconditional surrender, but the Americans kind of wanted to make it known that they were willing to, unofficially have some conditions. But there's like complicated story behind that. But the Russians
yeah,
cut contact with the Japanese. They just all of a sudden go cold. They stop talking to them. And at that point, the Japanese don't know what's going on. When the Russians invade, it was like their entire lifeline was gone. They had no choice and they had to jump into the arms of the Americans because they knew the number one enemy of Japan was communism. It always had been. They
yeah.
and the Soviets actually invaded the Sakhalin Islands and all that in the north, so they were coming in the Kurils, and they an
Uh,
invasion
I
of
think,
northern Japan was happening.
yeah, and I think we should also not forget that compared to the US, Russia's a much older enemy to Japan.
Of course,
So, I mean, you had your Russia-Japanese war. Like, until like, World War II, US and Japan in a military sense did not have anything. Like, we know Japan was not like, let's just say, friends with the US, especially after the mediation.
after
But
World War One, basically they became enemies. Yeah,
yeah, but that still gives like, Russia 20 years more animosity
yep,
timeline with Japan. So to them, that is the old enemy. That is what they
yep,
fear. And as you said, they did not like the communists.
yep.
And it was quite oppressive against to be a communist there. Like
Oh
the
yeah, the
Japanese,
most
Japanese.
anti-communist, more so
Yeah.
than even Germany. And I know a lot of people who don't know so much about Japanese the political scene of Japan, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It's not that much of it's kind of exciting. There's a lot of assassinations, but the most anti-communist nation by far. Like
Oh
it's a
yeah,
long
yeah.
shot. But I'll just finish
Yeah.
with this about this whole issue. For Americans, they have a hard time understanding because the idea that you've just had a nuclear attack on a city that killed hundreds of thousands of people obviously is going to definitely push somebody to surrender. Of course, it's a variable. I'm not saying it's not. But when the Russians invaded, what was the last hope of retaining some of the empire? Because the Japanese had already said, okay, well, we've lost all the Pacific holdings. They're not going to give it to us. We know we're not getting that. This is what really got them to surrender in the end. And if people don't believe that to be true, just look at, I think even on the Wikipedia page, you can look for this. Hirohito, he put out two different surrender messages, one to the civilian population in Japan and one to the military. And go read the one to the military. And it only talks about the Soviet invasion, basically.
Yeah,
So,
and yeah, I mean, because it really cannot be underestimated what Manchuria meant to Japan in terms of
yeah.
resources, because Japan as a country did not have the resources to finance a war. So
I mean,
that's
it was I think it was Dan Carlin who said it was the steroid that kept Japan like their empire alive. And because they invade Manchuria, they end up falling into a war with China. And to
yeah,
maintain Manchuria, they think that they have to defeat China. To defeat China, they realize they don't have the resources, so they go to war with the West. So they just keep
yeah.
jumping from one antagonist to the other.
It's like the domino effect.
Exactly. And it all came, and ironically, you even mentioned the Russo-Japanese War. Manchuria was the crux of all of this. It's almost like I keep saying, I had a professor who said it was patient zero for World War II. And in a lot of ways, it was. It was this melting pot that brought the USSR, China, and Japan to war with each other on multiple occasions, like the first
True enough.
Sino-Japanese War. And yeah, Japan never gave it up. They always said it was if they didn't retain control of it, then well, the communists, the Soviets, they're a dagger thrust from the home islands, as they used to say. They couldn't like the
Yeah,
Japanese were not pleased with just having Korea, even though I think
yeah,
that strategically protected them. But whatever, yeah,
yeah. But yeah, I think this is like where, like the skip. I think with regards to the Russian invasion, just to sum up, right? Just like, the scale and professionalism of such a thrust is and also the impact that it had. Like, as you said, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have definitely been a variable. Like, no one can say that, but it's not the only variable.
Yeah, actually, in one of
Now,
the meetings, I think it was, I don't know if it was a meeting on the 9th or on the 10th, but the Japanese officials, they had no idea that Hiroshima had been bombed. And they're having a meeting about the surrender because the communication links everything was destroyed. So for a
oh
while, they
wow.
didn't even know. And they were talking about the Russian invasion.
That just shows like what a situation they were in.
Oh,
Like,
yeah. I mean,
it's
if
just
someone's like, "Oh, why did Japan surrender?" I would say it's because of Operation Starvation. The uh, the campaign to mine all the seaways around the main island. It did what the operation said. It starved the population. The civilian population was so demoralized. They were not listening to police officers anymore. They were doing criminal activity, which is more
oh damn.
unusual in an Asiatic country. They're more collective societies. It's not like America or something. It was more unusual for them to do this types of things. And the most crucial thing is Emperor Hirohito received reports that common civilians were bad mouthing him, and
Yeah.
that freaked him out because again he wanted to protect the Kokutai. So it's kind of what ended the war in the end. I mean, they all knew it was going to end. It's just when were they going to pull the trigger? And yeah,
When would it end and what terms they can get? That's all was the question marks till
yeah.
then. But yeah, it really did was this was like, personally for me, like something that really changed my view because now it's a question of what was the truth, which we may never even know because we were not in the room where, these seven men decided what happened.
Yeah. Emperor Hirohito, he had a personal diary with meeting minutes that even his assistants didn't have, and the royal family has not given it to the public. Apparently, they're still holding on to it to this very day, and that will be
Oh, wow.
very interesting when that comes out.
If it comes out, I think I'll
Yeah,
have to add that.
exactly. Those royal
Well,
families.
it could be a wealth of data. They say data is the gold of today. So,
Yeah. Well,
so that'll be good.
I think that finished off those 3 points for this episode.
Yeah.
Although we've already talked about, we'll be doing another episode. And we'll talk about underrated aspects of World War II. We'll talk about Europe. But
Yeah.
I want to thank you again. It's incredible because I guess this is kind of like the fan experience, right? You're
Oh, I absolutely love this. So thanks for having me on here.
Oh, of course. It was so awesome. And, I really appreciate everything that you've done. I mean, we've been talking for more than a year at this point. I love
Yeah.
answering your questions. You always
Yeah.
stump me. You always stump me. And then I end up having to pull out a book and being like, oh my God, what was this again? Because I just don't remember whatever it was. But yeah,
Well, I'll have to thank you for like, not only letting me learn more, but, patiently answering my questions.
of course. So again, thanks. And well, we'll be seeing each other soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on, Greg, once again.